Stop everything, because at 88 years old, Robert Redford has finally let something slip that Hollywood spent decades protecting, polishing, and pretending didn't exist. Not a scandal, not an affair. Something far more intimate and far more devastating. In a rare, unguarded moment, the legendary icon reportedly acknowledged a truth so quietly woven into his life that most fans never realized it was there at all. And once you hear it, every role, every disappearance, every long silence suddenly makes sense. This isn't about the love stories you already know. This isn't about the headlines, the marriages, or the carefully curated public image. This is about the other love, the one that never left him, the one that shaped every choice, every retreat from fame, every refusal to play the Hollywood game the way everyone else did. Insiders say it was always there, hiding in plain sight, influencing his work, pulling him away from the spotlight just when the world wanted more. Because here's the part that hits hardest. This love wasn't something he chased. It was something he protected. Something he chose again and again, even when it cost him roles, relationships, and relevance in an industry that never forgives distance. And now, at an age where legends rarely revisit the past honestly, Redford's admission has cracked open a lifetime of speculation. Fans are stunned. Old interviews are being replayed with new meaning. Moments once dismissed as humility now feel like clues, and the internet is asking the same question in disbelief. Was this the real reason he walked away, long before anyone thought he would? Because if what he finally admitted is true, then Robert Redford didn't step back from Hollywood. He chose something else entirely. And what that other love really is changes everything. For decades, people thought they understood Robert Redford, the golden-haired leading man, the effortless icon, the man who seemed to glide through Hollywood without ever letting it touch him too deeply. But that assumption, according to those who have followed his life closely, was always the greatest misunderstanding of all. Because while the world was obsessed with his romances, his marriages, and his movie star mythology, Redford was quietly nurturing something else, something far more consuming than fame, and far more permanent than any relationship the tabloids ever fixated on. Insiders say the truth didn't come out in a dramatic confession or a tell-all interview. It slipped out slowly, almost accidentally, in the way older men sometimes speak when they're no longer interested in maintaining illusions. A comment here, a reflection there, a sentence that sounded harmless until you realized what it implied, that there was always another love running parallel to everything else. And that love was never Hollywood. People close to Redford say this other love wasn't secret in the scandalous sense. It was hidden because no one thought to frame it as a love story at all. It didn't involve red carpets or passionate headlines. It involved distance, withdrawal, control, choice. According to longtime collaborators, Redford's most consistent relationship wasn't with a person, but with a principle: independence, the ability to shape his life and his work without permission. And he chose it again and again, even when it cost him everything Hollywood promised. The pattern was always there, but few connected the dots. Redford would reach the peak of his popularity, then disappear. He would deliver a career-defining performance, then turn down projects everyone else would kill for. Studio executives reportedly grew frustrated with him early on, describing him as impossible to pin down. He didn't chase momentum. He actively resisted it. And that resistance, insiders now say, wasn't arrogance. It was devotion. According to people who worked with him in the 1970s and 80s, Redford often spoke about Hollywood like it was a place he passed through, not a home he belonged to. He was present but never fully invested. He did the work but refused the lifestyle. And when he finally admitted that there was something he loved more than acting itself, it explained decades of choices that once seemed baffling. That love was autonomy, the freedom to create on his own terms, the freedom to disappear when he needed to, the freedom to build something that would outlive him without requiring him to remain in the spotlight. This wasn't a phase, it was a lifelong commitment. And the clearest expression of it came when he did something almost unheard of for a star at the height of his power. He built an alternative to Hollywood instead of trying to conquer it. The creation of Sundance wasn't just philanthropy or passion, it was escape. Insiders say Redford saw the writing on the wall long before others did. He understood how the industry would tighten, how creativity would become commodified, how independence would be punished. So instead of fighting from within, he created something outside of it. That decision cost him mainstream relevance at times. It cost him roles, it cost him visibility, and he never regretted it. Friends say this is what he finally acknowledged, Not that he loved filmmaking, but that he loved the space around it more. The silence, the control, the ability to nurture others without being consumed himself. In hindsight, it explains why he often seemed emotionally distant in interviews, why he resisted being mythologized, why he refused to play the nostalgia game so many of his peers embraced. He wasn't running from Hollywood, he was running towards something else. What stunned fans most wasn't that Redford had another passion. It was realizing how deliberately he chose it over everything else. Over stardom. Over legacy as defined by box office numbers. Over the constant validation the industry demands. Insiders say he was fully aware of what he was giving up, and that awareness made the choice even more radical. He wasn't naive. He was intentional. There are people who say this other love also explains the emotional restraint that defined his personal life. Redford guarded his inner world fiercely. He didn't overshare. He didn't invite the public into his grief, his joy, or his regrets. And according to those close to him, that wasn't coldness, it was consistency. The same boundary he kept with Hollywood, he kept with the world. As he aged, that boundary only hardened. While others chased late-career comebacks, Redford stepped back. While peers clung to relevance, he leaned into absence. And when he finally spoke about what mattered most to him, it wasn't fame, awards, or even films. It was the freedom to choose his life without being consumed by the machine that made him famous. The revelation has forced fans to rewatch his career with new eyes. Every disappearance now looks intentional. Every refusal looks principled. Every quiet moment looks like loyalty, not to an industry or an image, but to a deeply personal idea of fulfillment. And once you see it that way, his life stops looking mysterious and starts looking disciplined. But here's the part insiders say hits hardest. Redford didn't frame this as a sacrifice. He framed it as a gift. A gift he gave himself early on, and one he protected fiercely for the rest of his life. And in doing so, he built a legacy that doesn't depend on applause. What no one knows yet, and what makes this admission even more powerful, is whether this other love cost him something he never fully recovered from. Because choosing independence often means choosing solitude. And while Redford never complained publicly, those closest to him say there are parts of that choice he's only now beginning to reflect on openly. And if that's true, then this isn't just the story of what he loved. It's the story of what he gave up to protect it. As the years went on, the pattern only became clearer, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. Robert Redford wasn't drifting away from Hollywood because he had lost relevance or passion. He was stepping back because he had already chosen something else, and he was loyal to it in a way most people reserve for marriage. Those close to him say his real commitment was never to fame, but to a life that allowed him to breathe without asking permission. What fans often misunderstood was how deliberate his distance was. Redford didn't retreat suddenly. He recalibrated slowly, intentionally, almost methodically. He took fewer roles. He chose projects that interested him rather than ones that would elevate his profile. He stopped explaining himself, and insiders say that was the point. The less he explained, the freer he felt. Hollywood thrives on access. Redford thrived on the absence of it. People who worked alongside him during this period describe a man deeply aware of the trade-offs he was making. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't resentful. He was resolved. According to longtime collaborators, Redford believed that the industry's hunger for constant output was incompatible with meaningful creativity. He saw fame as something that could hollow you out if you let it dictate your rhythm, so he refused to let it. This refusal cost him. Studio relationships cooled. Roles that once would have been his automatically went elsewhere. His name faded from marquee dominance, and he let it. Insiders say he viewed relevance as a currency that demanded too much interest. The more you borrowed from it, the more it owned you. Redford chose to pay it off early. What's striking in hindsight is how often he articulated this philosophy without anyone realizing what he was really saying. He spoke about space, time, and listening in interviews. He talked about protecting the process, about stepping aside so others could speak. These weren't platitudes. They were confessions disguised as humility. And now, looking back, they read like breadcrumbs. The Sundance Institute became the clearest expression of this other love. It wasn't just an organization, it was a sanctuary, a place where creativity existed without immediate commercial pressure. Insiders say Redford poured more emotional energy into Sundance than he ever did into maintaining his own stardom. He showed up, he listened, he advocated, and he did it without positioning himself at the center. For someone of his stature, that choice was radical. Friends say this is where the truth he finally admitted becomes undeniable. Redford didn't just enjoy independence, he needed it. It wasn't optional. The spotlight, for all its glamour, made him restless. Quiet, by contrast, gave him clarity, and clarity mattered more to him than applause ever did. But there's a cost to that clarity. According to those close to him, choosing distance over visibility meant choosing a kind of solitude that few people talk about honestly. Redford protected his privacy fiercely, but that privacy also insulated him. He became harder to reach, harder to read, harder to truly know. Some say this was strength. Others say it was a shield that sometimes kept people out who wanted to be close. As he aged, these reflections deepened. Redford reportedly began speaking more openly, not about regret, but about consequence. He acknowledged that choosing autonomy meant missing certain moments, certain connections, certain versions of life that require surrender to chaos. He didn't say he wished he'd chosen differently, but he admitted the choice wasn't painless. This is where the idea of his other love becomes complicated. Independence gave him purpose, but it also demanded discipline. It required him to say no when saying yes would have been easier. It required him to walk away when staying would have brought comfort. And that kind of devotion reshapes a person. It sharpens them, it isolates them, sometimes both at once. Those who know him best say Redford was never interested in being adored. He wanted to be useful. He wanted to build something that mattered without being consumed by it. That's why his legacy feels different from his peers. It's quieter, less flashy, more structural. You don't feel it in headlines, you feel it in the work of others he made possible. Now, at 88, the weight of that choice has finally surfaced in his words, not as a confession of loss, but as an acknowledgement of truth, that the thing he loved most was never something that could love him back. Independence doesn't hug you. Purpose doesn't console you. They give meaning, not comfort. And meaning, while powerful, can be lonely. Fans are only now beginning to grasp how much of himself Redford withheld from the world, not out of fear, but out of fidelity to a life he believed in. And that realization reframes everything. His silences weren't evasions, they were boundaries. His disappearances weren't retreats, they were returns to himself. What makes this admission so resonant isn't that it reveals a hidden scandal. It reveals a hidden cost. The cost of choosing principle over popularity, of choosing long-term impact over short-term affection, of loving something that asks you to stand apart instead of being held close. And that's why this story doesn't feel nostalgic. It feels unfinished. Because acknowledging a lifelong devotion often invites one final question. Was it worth it? Redford hasn't answered that outright. He hasn't needed to. The life he lived answers it in fragments, through what he built, what he refused, and what he quietly carried alone. And as the story continues to unfold, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about what Robert Redford loved. It was about how fiercely he chose it, knowing exactly what it would demand in return. By the time Robert Redford reached the final chapter of his life, the truth he had been circling for decades no longer felt dangerous to say out loud. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was settled. According to those who have spent time with him in recent years, Redford no longer speaks like a man guarding his legacy. He speaks like someone who already understands it. And in that understanding, the other love he finally acknowledged takes on its full weight. This wasn't a revelation driven by nostalgia. It was driven by clarity. At 88, Redford reportedly began reflecting not on what the world saw him as, but on who he had been most faithful to when no one was watching. And that's when the pattern became undeniable, even to himself. Every major decision in his life, every retreat, every refusal, every disappearance, pointed back to the same devotion. Not to an audience, not to acclaim, but to a way of living that required distance, restraint, and self-trust. Insiders say Redford has grown increasingly candid about the emotional consequences of that choice. Not in a confessional way, but in a matter-of-fact tone that carries more weight than regret ever could. He has acknowledged that choosing autonomy meant choosing solitude more often than comfort. That building space for others sometimes meant shrinking his own. That protecting his inner life meant accepting that many people would never truly know him beyond the image. What makes this final stage so striking is that Redford doesn't romanticize the cost. He doesn't frame himself as a martyr. He simply states the truth. Independence gave him purpose, but it did not give him companionship. And purpose, while fulfilling, is not the same as being held. That distinction, according to people close to him, is something he's only recently allowed himself to articulate without flinching. Looking back, his career reads differently now. The roles he chose, often quiet, morally complex, inward mirror the man he was becoming. The characters who walk away, the men who choose principle over power, the figures who understand that winning isn't always about conquest. Redford wasn't just acting these parts. He was rehearsing his own philosophy in plain sight. His gradual withdrawal from acting, once chalked up to age or fatigue, now appears far more intentional. Insiders say he stepped back not because he couldn't continue, but because he didn't want to dilute the life he had built. Fame, to him, was never a reward, it was a tool. And once it stopped serving his values, he set it down without ceremony. The quiet moments matter most in this final chapter. Redford reportedly spends more time observing than speaking, walking, listening, reflecting. Those around him describe a man at peace, but not untouched by the weight of his choices. Peace doesn't erase complexity, it just allows you to live with it honestly. And that honesty is what makes his late-life admission feel so profound. Fans who expected a revelation about romance or scandal were caught off guard by the simplicity of it all. There was no secret affair, no hidden heartbreak, just a lifelong commitment to something that demanded everything and gave back in ways that were subtle, not sensational. The other love was never about passion, it was about alignment. Redford's story challenges a culture obsessed with visibility. It asks an uncomfortable question. What if success isn't being seen, but being free? What if fulfillment comes not from applause, but from control over your own time, your own voice, your own boundaries? And what if the price of that freedom is being misunderstood for most of your life? Those closest to him say Redford has made peace with that misunderstanding. He knows many people will continue to frame his life through the lens of Hollywood mythology. But he also knows that mythology was never his truth. His truth lived in the margins, in the projects he supported quietly, the voices he elevated without credit, the moments he chose not to share. As he reflects now, there is no bitterness in his words, only acceptance. He has acknowledged that some connections might have been deeper if he had chosen differently. That some relationships might have lasted longer if he had been willing to compromise his need for space. But compromise, in his view, would have meant losing the one thing he valued above all else: self-authorship. And that's the heart of this story. Robert Redford didn't live a life driven by reaction. He lived a life driven by intention. Every step away from the spotlight was a step toward himself. Every silence was a form of protection. Every refusal was an act of loyalty, not to the industry, but to a personal code he never abandoned. At 88, finally admitting that truth doesn't feel like a confession. It feels like a closing of the circle. The man the world thought it knew is now clearly visible, not as an icon, but as a human being who made a hard choice early and stood by it, even when it hurt. There is no dramatic ending here, no final twist, just a quiet understanding that a life well lived doesn't always look loud from the outside. Sometimes it looks like absence. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like choosing something that never asks you to perform. And in that stillness, Robert Redford's legacy becomes something far more powerful than stardom. It becomes proof that loving your own freedom, fully, fiercely, and honestly, can shape a life just as profoundly as any romance ever could. If you're still here, don't click away, because stories like this don't come around often. What Robert Redford has finally acknowledged at 88 isn't just about one man's life. It's about the kind of truth most people never get brave enough to admit out loud. This wasn't a headline designed to shock you. It was a quiet revelation that redefines what love, success, and legacy actually mean when the cameras are gone. And here's why you need to stay locked in. Hollywood legends don't revisit their lives honestly unless something has shifted. When they do, it opens doors to conversations most of us avoid, about what we chose, what we protected, and what we may have sacrificed without ever saying it aloud. If you miss moments like this, you don't just miss celebrity news, you miss perspective. So don't let this be another video you have to remember later. Hit like if this story made you rethink what a successful life really looks like. Drop a comment if you see yourself in that tension between visibility and freedom, between being loved and being true to yourself. Your take matters more than you think, and this is one of those rare conversations where people actually listen. And subscribe because stories like this don't trend every day. They surface when someone finally stops protecting an image and starts telling the truth. When the next revelation like this comes, and it will, you'll want to be here, already part of the conversation, not catching up after it's passed.